Amanda, can you see this?
Yep, sure can, Mark.
Okay, awesome, great. All right, so as I said, my name is Mark Hoffman. I'm the Small Fruits Extension Specialist here at NC State. And today we're talking about strawberry cold protection, just as a refresher for everybody, because we're getting now into the season where we do have to start thinking about protecting our blossoms, strawberry blossoms. And this is structured into three parts, really. We're talking about when do we have to cold protect. We're talking about protection methods, and then I will show you some of the damages and how to identify cold damage as well. So I also want to point out for everybody who's a new grower or who needs a refresher on the basics of strawberry growing, we put together last year the Southeastern Strawberry School. That's a very good resource for everybody who is really new, or somebody who's in the first 2 or 3 years of strawberry growing. There's a lot of information in there which you can get. Those are small little videos which you can watch. They're going over the entire strawberry season. So I just wanted to put that out there before we start. So now cold protection, when? So that's the first question. And really cold protection depends a lot on your physiology of your plant. So there are times when your plant is in dormancy, and then such plants can be very, very cold hardy because your buds are still inside the ground. And as soon as your plant starts to transition into new leaves and into bloom, the temperatures of your tissue level are getting higher and getting higher until bloom is the most vulnerable stage where you can get damage if your temperature at tissue level drops below 30 °F, which happens quite a bit in spring. And so the takeaway here is really important, that the injury potential of your strawberry depends on your physiological stage and the growth stage of your strawberry. So during winter, your strawberries are a lot more hardy usually than when it goes into transition where we're at right now, where the strawberry starts to push new leaves. So that can become very, very important when we get into spring and we do have like frost events or something, and that is usually when we have to start protecting from your blossoms from temperatures that can harm those stages. So this is the most vulnerable stage, and this looks a little bit in the field like this. You do have dormant stages there. You don't have a lot of new growth, and then during late dormancy, where we should be right now, into like when we see a lot of new growth, this is when your plant becomes more vulnerable, because then your flower blossoms get out, and the more your buds are emerging, the more vulnerable your crop will be. And this is the stage where we have to do a lot of frost protection right there. Here another picture where you have a lot of different stages of strawberry flowers. You often have the same stage, several stages on the same plant. Again, this is the most vulnerable stage which you need to protect the most. But again, you have also stages like this or this which can get some damage as well if your temperatures drop too low. So now I always talk about temperatures, but we really have to think about two different events: frost versus freeze events. And this is a map from Sunday, end of January, where we had a freeze event in the entire region. You can see that the temperatures dropped a lot into the mid to lower teens. So those freeze events are based on wind-borne advective temperatures and air masses, often a really thick layer of cold air, often between 500 and 5,000 feet thick, which comes in from the north. And those temperatures do often have wind at the back end and in the front end. We had that this winter a lot, and they're very common in winter. And they're often, if you don't get dropped into like the low teens, you often don't have to necessarily protect your strawberries from those temperatures as long as they are dormant. So they're pretty common in winter. You can have freeze events in spring, and that is when they become extremely dangerous, because your plant is in a different physiological state in spring, and you're going to have to protect from temperatures which are much higher than what you see here right now on this map. So freeze events or hard freezes, as we call them here, they also usually take several days. They usually go over 2 or 3 days here. That's what we had this winter at least. And here in the Southeast, you often have like a switch between a hard freeze and then you have like warmer temperatures again and then a hard freeze again. In winter, if you're lucky, those warmer temperature periods don't go very long and they don't advance your crop. But we do have some winters where we do have very warm Decembers or Januaries where we even see blossoms on the plants, and that becomes very, very difficult then to protect and to make judgment calls. And we're going to go over this later, how to make a judgment call. But this year we are fine so far in most areas. But we're getting now into the time where our crop is advancing, and we're going to see some blossoms pretty soon. So frost events is what we're going to get now in the next couple of months, which will be very dangerous. That is in most of the cases a radiation event, which means radiational heat is emitted from plant tissue, and that lowers the temperature of that plant tissue, and that gets into a very dangerous area where plant tissue can be damaged. And frost events often happen at temperatures around or even above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're going to have to watch at different things, like the dew point is much more important if you're going to look for frost events and if you want to protect for frost events. And they're very common in spring, but we do have always every spring, especially in late spring, we do have frost events in North Carolina. They can be very devastating to crops, as most of you know. And strawberry, we are in a very good place because we can protect strawberries from most cold events, which is not the case for a lot of other crops. Frost events are often based on a cold air layer, so between a small layer of cold air, often between 20 and 200 feet. We call that an inversion. You can see that here often there's a little bit warmer air layer above the inversion. But again, they can be very dangerous, but in strawberries, we are able to protect from most of those cold events. So now if we talk about frost, something which is important, which we had this year already, a little bit later earlier this year in parts of the state, is black frost and hoarfrost. Most of the cases we have hoarfrost, which means this is a frost that comes in with high humidity. You see ice crystals and water crystals on your plant. So if you're a grower and you rely on looking on ice crystals which show up on your pipes or on your plants or on your vegetation around the strawberry field to make the decision whether or not you need to protect your plants, in a hoarfrost event that works. In the black frost event, however, that doesn't work, because black frost event happens with low humidity. And often the temperatures are somewhere around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but you will not see ice crystals because there's not enough humidity in the air. So that happens sometimes in North Carolina. And again, this can be, in this case, forecast tools are very, very important. I personally think forecast tools are anyways very important, especially around this time of the year. I would always look at the weather forecast at least 10 days out at this point of time. But again, especially if you expect a black frost, you're going to have to look at this because you will not see the signs of a typical frost outside, and you will still get damage on your blossoms. Freeze events, as I said, a completely different thing. There's a lot of cold air moving. It happens a lot in winter. We should get now into the time where we do have less freeze events in our area, and hopefully no freeze events later in spring. But there can be spring freezes like we had in 2007. Those can be extremely dangerous. They're hard to protect from, but they're also not that common. What is common though are frost freeze events, a combination of a radiational heat and a weather change, which brings colder air into this area. That happens relatively often. They're usually not as long, but they can be devastating. So those are also need to be forecast by a weather tool for your region, which you should look. So again, monitoring the weather forecast at this point of time is extremely important, and you can protect from most of those. freeze events are really hard to protect from, but again, you need to know what you're dealing with in the first place. So here I wanted to show just like, again, the critical temperatures of different tissue types in a strawberry flower, in a strawberry plant. You can see here the critical temperature for tight bud is about 22 degrees Fahrenheit, tissue temperature, not air temperature, tissue temperature. Open blossoms are 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's when they start getting damage. That is happening through radiational heat loss during a frost event very quickly. That can happen even if the air temperatures are way above freezing. So often we can get frost events even at temperatures at 38 or 39 degrees Fahrenheit, minimum air temperatures that can still, in a clear night, cause a lot of radiational heat loss on your strawberry blossoms. So that is the most stage which is most commonly damaged through cold events in the strawberry, and that is the stage which you also have to most commonly protect from cold damage during your strawberry season. So as take home here, strawberries need to be protected against two types of cold events, frost and freeze events. From December to February, you really the only thing you want to protect there is your crown from freeze damage. So those crowns, as long as you plant the dormant, should be okay at around 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit even. So if it drops lower, that is when you would deploy your row covers. Blossom protection, that happens usually now. I would not recommend at all, at least not in our region, to protect blossoms when you have early blossoms in January or February. Right now, blossoms which come like in March or mid of March, those are the blossoms that you do want to protect, and they can be need to be protected at relatively high minimum temperatures, even if you're like in the 30 range. That can cause damage if you have a radiational event, or if you have, especially if you don't have a lot of cloud cover and not a lot of wind speed. There's also the possibility, at least in spring, to have frost freeze events and rarely late spring freezes. They can be very devastating, so you have to monitor for those too. And protection methods for those vary a little bit compared to those which you would do, especially for a hoarfrost, which is our most common frost which we have in spring. So now talking about management methods, you see two here deployed. One is row covers, which a lot of growers use, and the other one is sprinkler systems. There's a lot of opinion out there. Some people really love row covers. Other people really love sprinkler systems. I personally think the best way to do it is to have both at least in place, because you never know what kind of cold event you will encounter later. They have both pro and cons. They both have positive and negative sides about both of them, and we're going to talk about this. And another tool which you don't see here, but which we will talk about here, is that how to monitor your weather, because that's really the first step, is to look into weather forecast and at least for the next 10 days and see what is the weather like, so that you are prepared and that you know what's happening in your field. So that's really important right now. First thing we talk about is a weather forecast. At this point of time, the weather is relatively hard to predict in our region because it fluctuates a lot between cold and warm events. Usually the 10-day weather forecasts are very critical and very accurate. So those are the ones which I would look at, that will give you at least 1.5 weeks of insurance of what most likely will happen in your region. So you need to know what kind of cold event you will confront in your field. That is extremely important. That means you need to look at your weather forecast, and you need to be able to diagnose your weather as well. And that's what we're going to go over this right now. So, of course, the first thing, you have to have a reliable and good weather forecast. We usually help you with this. We work with Avis together to send out weather advisories over this time of the year. They are a very good first step for you to like go into the weather forecast, but I highly recommend to have your own weather forecast as well, especially for your special region and for your special field, and so that you can formulate an idea of which kind of weather you will see in your field. As I said, 10-day weather forecasts are usually pretty reliable at this point of time. And the first step is really what kind of event you will see there. So there are a couple of checkpoints which you want to go through. The first one is always look at minimum temperatures. That's what we usually provide a lot. We often talk about wind speeds and dew points as well in our weather advisories. And then you want to also check for humidity and other things which might impact, especially if we're talking about frost events, which might impact whether or not you see a hoar or black frost, for example. And as I said, our strawberry advisories are the first step. This is the region we cover. We go from the mid-Atlantic to the southeast, and we do very general updates. So we don't go specific in different regions, but if we see something which might be dangerous for one specific region, we're going to point that out in that advisory as well. So it's a very good step to start with that. What I would do is I would go then into your specific forecast of your site with the weather service you're working with. And then at this point, I would look 7 to 10 days ahead of time and go through several checkpoints. And I will put this onto the homepage as well. There's a very good publication from a couple of years ago that's definitely worth reading and will give you a lot of insight on how to look at your weather forecast. So the first step is look at air temperature, and you make a decision whether or not your air temperature is lower than 32 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. If it's lower, you really need to look at wind speeds. And if you have high wind speeds and very low temperatures, then you're getting into a lot of trouble, because we usually look at the frost freeze or at an advective freeze event, which is coming in. So that would be like one of the big things for you to say, you know what, in 4 or 5 days, it looks like we're getting really a frost freeze event. So we need to like make sure that we have everything in place to protect our flowers. So because those can be very devastating events. If your air temperature is higher, and if your air temperatures are higher, then you're often not into trouble unless you do have clear sky, and that can give you a lot of hoarfrost. And again, if you have very low dew points and you have not a lot of humidity, then that can even become black frost. In those moments, you do need a little bit more heating capacity because you do have less humidity in your air. So again, if you go through this looks very complicated, but it's actually really not. So you just look at your temperature, your wind speeds, your cloud cover, your dew point, and if you're at a low dew point, you want to look at your humidity as well. And those 5 things, if you check those 5 things, and then you will kind of have a good idea of what kind of event will happen. And we will give you that advice as well in our forecasts for the region, but again, that can change from side to side as well. So definitely good for you to do this as well. So there are several options to protect your strawberries. That your very strawberries have that advantage that they can be protected, and a lot of crops can't. Floating row covers is one of the methods, and floating row covers can be really used for several things, not just for protecting for cold damage, which is what we're going to talk about. And for cold damage, you can use row covers to protect in winter and in spring. You see here dormant plants in winter, and then in spring you have plants with flowers on them. You also can use row covers to promote plant development. That's usually happening after planting. We're not going to talk about this today. I'm just going to say that you look at different things if you for the different times when you use row covers. So in October, November, you would more look for growing degree days in your weather forecast. While if you protect for freeze events, then you would look at temperature and weather for a minimum temperature mostly. And then if you're going into spring and you really don't know if it's a frost or a freeze event, then you have to go through the entire thing, which I just talked about: dew point, minimum temperature, humidity, wind speed, etc., etc. So that becomes really important, especially in the time which we're going in right now. That is extremely important. During winter, you protect your ground from cold temperatures. So often those temperatures can be in the teens before you have to put your row covers on, depending on the physiology of your crop. And then now, when we go into March and your plants starting to grow and push, you really have to look at how do I protect those flower blossoms and the flower buds from things like frost or freeze frost events, which we'll get a lot more in the next couple of months. So that's then becomes very complicated to look at your weather forecast, and you have to check a couple of things on your weather forecast, not just minimum temperatures. Minimum temperatures will not be enough to correctly predict every time, every weather event, which will probably happen in your field, if that makes sense. All right, so row covers have a lot of pros and a lot of cons. The pros is that you can use it, as I said, for a couple of things, really. Often it can be helping in freeze and frost events. They also can be used to improve growing degree days, but they also don't require any night shifts, and you don't need a lot of water for those as well. But as you can see in this picture as well, they also have a lot of negative parts. They're dirty, they can move stuff around. And there are a lot of things also on cons, on challenging on row covers. Labor is, of course, one. You need quite some people, especially if you have a larger field, to move those row covers around. They can be a problem if they get wet, which happens sometimes. They can cause a lot of damage if they get wet. They can build disease, and pests can be built up under the row covers. And as I said, they can be flying around when there's too much wind, and you can get pollination problems on the row covers as well. And some cultivars do that more than others, but that happens as well. So again, no method is perfect. A lot of people use row covers, and a lot of people use sprinklers, and some people use both, and both have advantages and disadvantages. And it really depends on your farm, which one you want to use. We recommend to have both, because if you get into a freeze frost or frost freeze event, then you're going to need both. We recommend to measure temperatures on the row covers. I know that's also critical scene. That would at least allow you not to look as much as on the dew point, because it will tell you exactly what the tissue temperature is on your plants. But again, if you don't do that, you're going to have to really look at dew point and humidity to make sure that you protect your plants at the time when they need to be protected. Row covers usually are put on in the afternoon, so before the sun goes down, and then you leave them on until your frost or freeze event is over. Often that's like just a day later in the morning, but you need to put those row covers on before the sun goes down, so that the heat, which is covered, which is in the black plastic, under the plastic, can stay under and heat those strawberry plants, give those strawberry plants a couple of heat units. Again, in winter, you use row covers to protect dormant plants. And there is something which I want to say, that if you're getting into a growth stage right now where you do have new leaves coming out, and we do find some anecdotal, not scientific, anecdotal evidence that Chandler plants, that in some cultivars, if they're exposed to the mid-teens and they have been hardened off, that they often can be used without row covers. So that is something, again, it depends a lot on your physiology of your plant. If your plant had not the chance to harden off, let's say you had a very warm fall, and then the temperatures drop right into the teens, so that's going to be a problem. But if your plants could harden off, you often are in much better space coming out of winter if your plants had the chance and the temperatures were low enough for them to harden off than if they're not. So again, I think the takeaway here is that you need to think about the history of your plant, the history of your field, and was there enough cold units for those plants to harden off, or do I have to protect because they're very vulnerable at this point at the moment already? I think this year for most regions we're good, but there are some years where we do have very warm winters, and then that becomes a problem as well. So now sprinkler systems are the second methods which we use for protection, and they also have a lot of positive and a lot of negative things to it, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. Very, very important if you use sprinklers is that you do have decent and consistent coverage with water on your bud tissue. And this diagram shows you what's happening. So often, so that you have consistently new ice building on top of your water ice layer. and that heat, which is that energy which is emerging through the process of building ice, is transferred into your leaf and bud tissue, and that is what keeps your leaf and bud tissue from freezing. So if you lose that water layer, that thin water layer on top of your ice, you're going to lose that ability of protecting your leaf and bud tissue from freezing, and you actually will freeze your leaf and bud tissue if you do not have correct coverage. So that is extremely important with a sprinkler. And if that is not happening, you cause more damage than good. Thankfully, most sprinkler systems which we use are equipped for most of our common frost events and which we have here in the Southeast, so that you often don't have a problem with this. But again, sprinkler heads can break, or they can clog, and that is when you get into problems if you don't have enough coverage. So your sprinkler should always look like this. Your strawberry plant, you need to have this clear ice layer and those noses which run down. That's extremely important, because that is where your heat is exchanged. And if you start seeing like really white, thick ice on your plants, then you know you have a problem, because that is the ice you do not want to see on a strawberry plant when you put on your sprinklers. So there are a couple of things there. I'm not a sprinkler expert, so I'm just going to repeat what I've heard. But what is important is that you do have a decent rotation time, so that you get this constant coverage on your plant tissue. You do want to have a uniformity in distribution and droplet size, and you do want to have something which is more or less freeze tolerant. So there are sprinkler systems which are easier to use and which are protected a little bit from ice buildup, because if you do otherwise, if you build ice, you're going to have to run around and shake those sprinklers and knock the ice off. That can be very labor intensive and also very dangerous, because during that time you don't provide coverage of your plants. And then something which is low maintenance is also important, something which you can probably turn in with a few turns and replace very quick. That might be also important. So now you can see here that theoretically a sprinkler can help at several wind speeds with several temperatures. But again, this is important to know that this is not for every sprinkler and for every nozzle. Very important to know is that you can't, or you shouldn't, increase the application, the number of inches which you apply per acre, depend on your nozzle side, not on your water pressure. So you cannot put up your water pressure, because the nozzle will put out a certain amount of water, and that's it. So 964 nozzles, for example, deliver a 0.12 inches per acre per hour. That is calculated around 60 gallons of water per minute per acre, and that will give you like quite a bit of water which you're going to use there. However, if you use a nozzle like this, that will get you into this range. So everything which is green will work, and maybe you can go down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit and you're lucky, and you can go with a little bit higher wind speed and you're lucky. So but the nozzle size makes a big impact on whether or not a sprinkler will provide good coverage. So that is important too. That's probably the takeaway here. Again, for most of our events, which we have, for 90% of the cold events we see in spring, if not more, you should be fine in this green range where you're at right now. It becomes more difficult with higher wind speeds, of course, and it becomes more difficult the lower your temperatures will be. Yeah, as I said, most sprinklers work between 20, 24, and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And if it gets lower and you have the wrong nozzle, that can also cause a lot of damage. If you see building up this white layer on your plants, that is when you know you get into a lot of trouble. So it is also suggested that you monitor your dew point and you start your sprinkler a little bit earlier if your dew point is lower. That is also very important. Often you look at temperatures. If your dew point goes into like the mid to low 20 range, you do want to start your sprinkler already at like 37, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and not just at 32. So that's also important to remember. The dew point makes a big impact when you start your sprinkler, because your tissue, you need to protect your tissue temperature, not the air temperature. So if you have a low dew point, your tissue temperature might already be at those 30 degrees, and you're going to have to start protecting. But there are a lot of positive things about sprinklers. First of all, if you have some experience with sprinklers, you know what your sprinkler system can do, what it can do, and you know how to use it. So you get a lot better with more experience with sprinklers. They're not very labor intensive, as I said. So for small farms or for farms where you only have 1 or 2 people, that might work very well, and can be used in most events. And of course, they allow also for pollination to a certain extent. You have a lot of water usage. It's very complicated use, as I said. And especially if you're new to it, you will make a lot of mistakes with those. And again, there's also always a risk of causing damage, the same like with row covers. And they require some maintenance. And you have several other diseases which can build up, especially things which can spread through water, like pythiums or phytophthora. And then you also have can cause flooding of fields if you do use them a lot. So there again, there is no method is perfect. There is no silver bullet solution. We recommend to have both methods in place during this time, especially during this time, which starts now during spring. So now there are a couple of questions here. Single layer row covers are usually useful down to 24 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets lower, you can add a second row cover. You can add a little bit drip tape to it, so that you often provides a little bit heat units, but it gets complicated if you really need to protect for like very, very low temperatures. And often a sprinkler system helps with those events. Soaked row covers, which then freeze, can be a very big problem. And black frost, as I indicated before, you need to look at your temperature forecasts, and because you will not see those ice crystals which you will see at hoarfrosts. So we put together this little table. It's not ideal, but it gives you a little bit the gist of it. So hoarfrost, so this area here is like the most common frost cold event you will see over March, April, and May. We have quite a bit of hoarfrost, especially early April into mid-April. We do see a lot of that. So that is the most common event. And as I said, you are okay with either a sprinkler or a row cover on those in most cases. Same goes for black frost. You can cover with row covers for black frost as well as with the sprinkler. Again, because the dew point is so low, we only gave it 2 pluses because you might drop to those 24 degrees Fahrenheit faster than with a hoarfrost. Again, that's not very common, but it can happen. Frost freeze events are also not very common, but it can happen. And those are more difficult because a sprinkler system alone, because of the associated wind speeds and the deep temperatures, are probably not working. And row covers alone, even if you double cover, might not do the job, especially, but there is the option of double covering. So that's why we gave it 2 pluses. But there's also the option of like using sprinklers over row covers, which is one of the few events where I would say this is something which you might want to try. It's very difficult because you don't want your row covers to freeze. You will still have to cover those entire row covers. They're going to be wet. You're going to have to take them off, and you have to let your sprinklers run for like until you are up above freezing. So, but again, it's better than losing your crop. There's not a lot of options. And then if we really go into like the point where we have freeze events, which I hope we won't. We didn't have a spring freeze for a very long time. We had frost freeze events last year, but we didn't have a freeze event. If we don't want to go into this area here, then because the only thing which you can do there is row cover, everything else will not work in a freeze event, and that is really dangerous. But as I said, most of the time you're encountering a hoarfrost. Frost freeze events are a little bit more dangerous, but if you have row covers, you're probably a little bit better set up than with sprinklers for those. And freeze events are very difficult to manage. As I said, double covering can add heat units. It's a lot more work, and you get also less light into the canopy. And then drip tape can also add a little bit heat, I wouldn't count on this, but sometimes if you are getting at this 24 degree thing and you're not going lower, then maybe little drip tape can actually help to keep your heat units up. Other question was when to protect flowers. So that's again, often we have winters. This winter was relatively cool, so we didn't have a lot of early enhanced crop, but we have several winters before where we had very early enhanced strawberries that had fruit, that had even fruit, but also berries on them in January or early February. Just only so that we had like a cold period after that. So that is, I usually don't recommend to protect those at all, because what you have to consider is that once you start protecting your strawberries, you are committed. You cannot stop. You have to pull through. And we do have a lot of very cold events in February and March and in January that will make it very difficult for you to protect those flowers. So we often say that, you know, you want to start somewhere mid or beginning of March and then protect all the way through, because you will deal with different cold events, more frost events, less freeze events. It makes it easier to protect your crop. And so we usually recommend to let those flowers burn off the plants. It depends a lot on the region where you're at. Some regions are earlier than North Carolina, and it's a little different there. But generally for us, this is a golden rule to say that not before beginning of March in the eastern part of North Carolina, and then the Piedmont a little bit later, and then the western part even later than that. So sprinkler and covers can have pros and cons. Try to have both in place. And I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of damage that can be caused by cold events. So on the left-hand side, you see winter damage. So this is foliar damage, which happened on a unprotected plant in winter during a freeze event. So that is usually not very dangerous. The crown on this particular plant was still okay. So this is something which you usually don't have to worry too much about, but you see that a lot in your field, especially after cold events. A good opportunity here is to go through and get rid of those dead leaves, because they only harbor disease. On the right hand side, you see this is a flower which was not protected and has cold damage. You see like it's all dark and black in here. That flower will not produce any fruit, and that is the most vulnerable stage which we are talking about today. So really keep that in mind. You want to protect your flowers over the next 2 months so that you do get fruit out of those and that they don't die. If you are worried in winter about crown damage, you can assess those by cutting through the crown. But again, we're over the time. And as I said, if you do have very hardened off plants, they often can survive temperatures between 10 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit. It really gets dangerous if you get into like an area where you did have a very warm winter and your plants didn't have enough chilling units to harden off, basically. Yeah, as I said, try to avoid especially this damage through the methods which we discussed today. Otherwise, you will get a lot of deformed fruit. You will get a lot of dead flowers, and that will really have a tremendous impact on your crop, and can be the make or break point for a lot of growers. So really be aware of that. You get a lot of that stuff if you do have frost damage, but also sometimes we see a lot of that through poor pollination. So depending on your spring, if we have a really cold spring, we often see a lot of that as well, especially if you use a lot of row covers. Again, there's no silver bullet solution, but those are the kind of damages you can see through frost or through poor pollination. And again, use an integrated approach. That's what we recommend in spring. You don't have to do this to the entire year, but right now, I would recommend to at least think about it. Don't start too early. This is the time when you're like March. This is the time when you should start protecting your flowers here in North Carolina. And again, this is a very crucial common thing. Again, it can cause a lot of damage if you do not have frost protection in your place. And then black frost, be aware of black frost. We discussed this a lot today. you can be very unfamiliar with. It's not very common, but it can happen. The dew points are usually lower in black frost. The humidity is very low. You will not see ice crystals. But if your temperature forecast goes to black frost, then that is what you still need to protect, even if you don't see ice crystals in the field. What do you need to be prepared with? Numerous frost events, which we'll have every spring. Possible frost freezes. Last year we had one, and the year before, not in every region, but we did had regions in the Piedmont where we had frost freeze events last year. And frost events are very common. We will have frost events this spring. There was no spring without frost events in North Carolina. And hopefully not an advective freeze, because those are very, very hard to protect from. And yeah, and then look at our strawberry portal. We do put weather advisories there. You also will find all of this on our strawberry portal. And we have a couple of other resources here as well. As I said, the strawberry school for everybody who's new to strawberry growing is definitely a good source. And then I also want to thank Dr. Barclay Poling, who helped me a lot with this today, and is great help. And thank you all for listening. And then I think we do have some time for questions as well. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and